Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the last for this series seminar of the digital classicist. And today, I think that we have a wonderful way of closing this series because, well, that's a little bit selfish. We're talking about some of my favorite topics ever. So we're talking about 3D and Pompeii. So we are we are absolutely delighted to welcome Callie McClinton today, which, I was also lucky enough to meet in person just by chance last year in Rome. So I'm very pleased that she accepted our invitation to apply for this call for papers. And she's talking to us today about the application of photogrammetric 3D modeling to Roman domestic space. Kelly is just completing her PhD Bloomington, Indiana University, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and we look forward to hearing all about those Pompeian houses.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vitale. Yeah, it's a pleasure. I just wanted to say a brief hello before we switch into the screen share. So it's a pleasure to get to come to you today and talk about two of my favorite topics as well, 3D modeling and Pompeian houses. So let's be sure the screen share is working. Can I just get a okay, Valeria, to be sure the slides are showing?
Yes, we don't see them yet, but...
Okay. And
yes, perfect.
Okay. Great. Okay. And they are showing, just to be sure.
Yes.
Okay, great. This whole thing would be rather boring without the images. First, my gratitude to Dr. Gabriel Baudard and Dr. Valeria Vitale for inviting me to contribute to the Digital Classicist London Seminar Series. Sincere thanks also to my current advisor, Dr. Bernie Fisher, for his continued and generous support of my work. At Indiana University, thank you also to my co-advisors, Dr. Julie Van Voorhees and Dr. Luis Rocha. In addition, I'd like to thank briefly Dr. Eleanor Leach and Dr. Elaine Gazda, finally, Dr. John Clark, who have all been crucial in the execution of this work. And a warm thank you as well to the Superintendenza Archaeologica di Pompeii, the National Science Foundation, the Schrader Foundation, and the Department of Informatics at Indiana University. So first, why am I not in London today? Well, last week I attempted to jump off a cliff and it did not go as well for me as it might have. So in short, it'll be a few weeks until I'm able to walk again. And until then, it's a pleasure to bring this presentation to you virtually. And thank you so much also to the seminar series for being willing to let me do this virtually. So a quick overview about what we'll talk about today. So first, I'll talk about the motivation for the project, and I'll also cover the background for the research, briefly the methods chosen, and then I'll conclude with the case study itself as well as its results, and then go over some future research directions. And really towards the end, I think that would be one of the areas that I'm really hoping to discuss with you all there in London, is looking towards the future of this type of research and how we can ensure that the results of projects like this actually are able to be maintained and sustained over time moving forward. So here you can see a video of a photogrammetric model of room 16 in the House of Marcus Lucretius. And it's well known that wall paintings in Pompeii face dangers of damage and destruction. And while efforts are underway to preserve the examples that have come down to us today, after excavation, even new finds often be able to decay from the moment they're exposed to the air. So digital photogrammetry has been used for the documentation, preservation, and reconstruction of archaeological sites, but photogrammetry is also well suited to the illustration and reconstruction of Roman domestic interiors. Unlike traditional photography, digital modeling can offer three-dimensional documentation. As a result, it can preserve not only the orientation and visual impression of multiple walls, but also the positions of the wall paintings themselves in situ. So this seminar discusses the results of several photogrammetric campaigns recently undertaken to document the House of Marcus Lucretius. In the process, it will explore the combination of visual analysis with digital tools and the use of 3D models in particular to represent complex relationships in space. To conclude, future avenues for research will be discussed, including the creation of a database that might facilitate visualizing even more connections within this material record. It should be noted that ours is not the first 3D modeling campaign to be undertaken on the House of Marcus Lucretius. So on the left, you see a 3D restoration model recently produced by the wonderful Pompeii project at the University of Helsinki, and several 3D models of other houses in Pompeii will also be discussed in due course. It's possible to view a digital model of Roman wall paintings as the 21st century equivalent of more traditional illustration methods, such as watercolors, as the one you see here. Such methods have been used by archaeologists for centuries, and from these older forms of documentation, 3D models have inherited many of their principal functions, along with several new ones that are advantageous to the study of Roman wall painting and domestic space in particular. The important role of illustration in archaeology was recognized early in the history of the field. So from the 15th century onward, much of the graphic recording of excavation sites, such as Stonehenge, was accomplished through drawings and paintings. In the first minute book of the Society of Antiquaries of London in 1717, William Stuckley argued heatedly for the importance of illustration in the study of ancient objects. When modern archaeological publication and illustration arrived in the 19th century, systematic and scientific documentation methods were adopted quickly, and schematic plans and line drawings, such as the one you see here, quickly became standard components of modern excavation. One of the first projects to use such methods were actually the excavations at Cranbourne Chase carried out by Augustus Pitt Rivers, and other projects such as the Sardis expedition quickly followed suit. Interpretive drawings were then used to examine possible architectural reconstructions. For example, here you can see a computer-generated line drawing of the Temple of Artemis at Sardis based on the floor plan that you saw in the previous slide. Such illustrations allow archaeologists to experiment with various possibilities and visualize structures as they might have appeared in antiquity. One of the most famous sites to be illustrated using many of the techniques noted above is Pompeii. Virtually from the moment excavations began, detailed plans of the uncovered buildings were created to document the site. And these records serve not only to illustrate scholarly publications, but also to preserve the arrangement of wall paintings that had been selected for display in the nearby museum. A recent exhibit in the Museo Archeologico Nazionale di Pompeii highlighted the use of engravings, watercolor reconstructions, and miniature scale models in these early phases of excavation. Even today, these records remain vital for the study of Roman domestic space because much of the painting is now faded or has even disappeared entirely. In the 1990s, newer digital methods began to be used in conjunction with these more traditional techniques. Such newer forms of documentation were not meant to replace the photographs and drawings. Instead, digital models quickly became supplements to these more traditional methods. Digital representations of spaces augmented photographs and drawings by preserving the three-dimensional aspects of a space. Within a 3D model, a viewer is able to virtually experience reconstructed elements and acquire a sense of scale. For example, the tumulus model you see here, produced by Dr. Philip Stinson, conveys the reconstructed painting arrangement, but also the confined and intimate feel of the room itself. In comparison to more traditional methods of modeling and line drawing, 3D data capture techniques such as photogrammetry also have several advantageous features over and above the more traditional methods. So photogrammetry, like laser scanning, is well suited to quickly capturing a record of the site as it appears and requires no direct contact with the original material. Once 3D models of a single wall painting or even an entire room are created, the results can be easily compiled into a comprehensive record of the space, or in some cases, the entire site, as you see here. A photogrammetric 3D model can also serve as a basis for a subsequent reconstruction model, as we'll see in a moment. In brief, photogrammetric models can be powerful aids both to documentation and visualization in art history and archaeology. And as we will see, they can even aid a scholar throughout the research process itself. It is worth noting that spaces in the Bay of Naples have often been investigated through a digital approach to visual analysis. A notable use of modeling within perception studies is the facilitation of a quick comparison between the preserved remains and an overlaid hypothetical reconstruction, as you see in the images on the right. This can be done by layering the model of the state of the structure underneath the current restoration model. Software then allows a user to toggle quickly from one model to another, facilitating a quick visual comparison between the reconstruction model and the extant material record. For example, the Swedish Pompeii project and the model you've been viewing here included both a state and reconstruction model in their visualization of the house of Caelius Secundus. This was accomplished directly in the 3D Geographic Information System, or 3D GIS. A bit closer to home, here at King's College London, the Atlantis project created a model of Villa A, or the Villa of Pompeii, in Unity 3D. This visualization allows a viewer to simply press the R key on their keyboard and toggle between the current and restored state of the villa on their desktop computer. Another advantage of digital illustration is that it allows for experimentation. So Dr. Bernie Fisher and Dr. Philip Stinson digitally reconstructed the famous room 16 in the Villa of the Mysteries, and then experimented with how lighting moved throughout the room during the day. By visualizing the amount of sunlight allowed into the room via doorways and windows over the course of the day, it was then possible to conclude that oil lamps would have been necessary beginning in the late afternoon. From there, they considered the ideal placement of the lamps and furniture within the room. Such experimentation is certainly feasible on site, but considerably more difficult. A digital illustration easily allowed for the visualization of these multiple scenarios. Finally, digital illustration can be used to visualize complex quantitative data sets within ancient architectural settings. In a study of several Theron murals in late Bronze Age Akrotiri, all possible view sheds were calculated in GIS using a technique called iso-vista analysis. Within the model, all viewer locations were identified by sampling the edges of a model outside the room at equal intervals. These are indicated by the red dots in the image you see here. A computer script was then used to animate a light source over each viewing location in succession at eye level, or approximately 1.55 meters. Information on the visibility of the fresco surface was then extracted and mapped onto a graph. This method resulted in individual drawings which showed how much of the frescoed area could be seen from each viewing location in the room. Important spatial relationships and the visual experience of a person moving through the space were thus systematically recorded. This approach not only provided a thorough record of the visual experience, but according to the researchers, also brought to light aspects of the viewing experience which would not have been immediately perceivable by simply walking through the reconstruction. All these projects in some sense address the question of how a digital illustration can be used as a research tool. Although the use of 3D models as a component of archaeological illustration is a relatively recent development, as we've seen, there's a long tradition of using 2D models in the study of Roman domestic space in particular. Post-excavation, researchers were often only able to visit the empty shell of a Pompeian house, and as a result, illustrations have been used on a number of occasions to consider the interaction of visual wall paintings or even entire programs. So on the image on the left, you see Dr. Bettina Berkman utilized a 2D reconstruction to discuss the visual program within the House of the Tragic Poet. And similarly, on the right, a 3D reconstruction was used to discuss the visual program at Bosco Reale. 3D models can thus be used for a variety of research purposes, including facilitating greater understanding of interactions between architecture and objects, promoting the perception of unanticipated emergent properties within the space, highlighting areas where sources may conflict if multiple sources were used in the creation of the 3D model, elucidating the relationship of large and small scale features, and finally helping us to formulate hypotheses. While all these potential uses are pertinent in general to the field of art history and archaeology, for studies concerned with viewing, interpretation, and perception within Roman domestic space, a digital illustration can be especially beneficial. It's generally assumed that aspects of social significance are embedded in such displays and that it is possible to understand daily life through the careful observation of them. Depending on the project, it may be useful to consider a space at various points in time, for example, as it appeared at the time of excavation in contrast to how it might have appeared in antiquity. The use of visual analysis tools such as 3D models thus allow a researcher to not only consider a space at many different points in time, but also to organize the symbolic information that has been observed on site. Digital models also allow a researcher to revisit the space as needed, in the case that they've hurt their leg, and reconsider the interactions between objects in a reconstructed context, such as the one you see here. So while our discussion thus far has centered on the more historical and theoretical aspects of illustration, it's also perhaps useful to briefly describe the practical components of digital modeling. And I really wanted to do an in-person demo, but unfortunately that's going to have to wait till the next time I'm in London, or I think Dr. Bodard and Dr. Vitale have volunteered potentially afterward if you're really interested in the question and answer session. So the methods and instruments used for data capture depend on the 3D model's intended application primarily. And the purposes of this case study, as I've stated, were to create a high-resolution photogrammetric model, and the visualization was meant to facilitate a deeper understanding of this space and its components. This type of modeling provided the following benefits over and above the other possible methods available to us, such as laser scanning. So first, it was possible for a single person to capture and process the model components. Secondly, there was a relatively low cost for the equipment, as we'll see in a minute. The results were photorealistic, so the extant wall paintings and the archaeological material were captured at a resolution that is, arguably fairly close to what it would be if I held it in front of my eyes. And then a state and photogrammetric model is a great starting point for further reconstruction, so we can work backward from what we see today to the ancient structure as it might have appeared prior to the eruption of Vesuvius. To create a photogrammetric state model, the first step is a thorough photographic campaign. For the case study described below, the team used a Canon 5DSR digital camera with a Zeiss Otis 28mm lens. In the darker rooms, a Nikon D850 was used with a Nikon 28mm lens, which was well suited to the low lighting conditions often found in the small dark rooms off the atrium. This video briefly shows the process for photographing an individual, and the same process was used for each room in the house, but multiplied by many times over. One of the keys of photogrammetric modeling is overlapping photos, and our lab generally aims for about 40% overlap between each shot. So for each room, a set of laminated photogrammetric targets, such as those you see on the left, were set down, and the distance between each target was measured, giving the model a relative scale. A robust tripod was also useful on the uneven flooring, which is so often characterizes some of these excavated spaces. And then a monopod was used to photograph the higher areas of the wall painting panels. For each room, camera and tripod were placed in the center of the space, and 3 rounds of photos were captured. One aimed at the lower portion of the wall, one at the center, and one at the upper region using the monopod. This floor plan shows the process undertaken for a single room. Depending on the width and height of the room, the tripod and or monopod was then moved into the 4 corners, and the same process was repeated. After these rounds were complete, the camera was then positioned closer to the wall to capture areas of detail, such as area of interest in wall painting or flaking pigment. And just to give a general idea, for a high resolution model for the smaller rooms, it was generally necessary to capture about 600 to 800 photos for the smaller rooms, and then as many as 1,500 to 2,000 photos for the larger rooms. Once the photographic campaign was complete, the photos were then edited for consistent exposure. During this process, it was critical to take a number of photos also at transition points, such as doorways and windows, where tie points are more likely to be created between individual room models. Once the photos were complete, post-processing was a relatively quick process. Reality capture was used to stitch the photos together and create a draft mesh model. This draft was then edited in ZBrush to prepare the final version, and copies of the photos and the 3D models were delivered to the Superintendenza, and finally uploaded to Sketchfab, the online hosting service I showed you earlier for hosting 3D models. The results of the 3D data capture campaign and post-processing described thus far yielded a state model of the garden and its surrounding rooms, as you see in the screenshots here. The primary goal of the art historical project was to then explore the visual impact of the central garden on an ancient visitor. As mentioned earlier, for this project, it was especially useful to reinsert artifacts and paintings that had been removed from the site during the initial excavations, and then experiment with different view sheds into the central garden. Prior to digitally experimenting with the 3D model, however, the team explored the existing literature on the site and how the garden had been illustrated and understood both by the initial excavators and then by subsequent scholars. So in 1847, the English architect and antiquarian Edward Faulkner was granted special permission to oversee the excavation of the House of Marcus Lucretius. You can see his original drawing of the house on the right, as well as a contemporary engraver's impression of the garden on the left. So Faulkner compared the overall visual effect of the garden in the House of Marcus Lucretius to a theatrical display. Over a century later, Eugene Dwyer, following in his footsteps, similarly described the garden display as a marionette theater, primarily emphasizing the lines of sight from room 16 and room 15, such as the illustration you see here. Paul Zonker has followed in this interpretation, likening the sculptural display to a stage set, and Yves d'Ambre proposed a slightly modified reading of the garden as a tableau vivant, or living picture, set in the middle of the house. Kim Hartswick has most recently pointed out that the sculptural arrangement in the central garden was likely designed to enhance the view of the central fountain and make a relatively small space in the house feel a bit bigger. While all varying in the analogies used, all of these interpretations center their arguments on the idea that the raised garden and the resulting sight lines, which place the viewer in either room 15 or 16, imitate a miniature stage. From these angles, as well as from when seen from the street, the garden does indeed resemble an area for performance. If a viewer stands directly in front of room 15, then the series of visual planes created by the garden, recessed to blind him, and surrounding tripartite frame strongly recalls the complex visual effect created by a typical skyline fronds of a Roman theater, such as the one you see on the right. This interpretation, however, depends partly on the placement of sculpture facing towards the central atrium, and the locations of these statuettes is by no means certain. Recent excavations undertaken in the house by the University of Helsinki did not reveal any statue bases in the garden, and unfortunately no engravings or photographs of the garden date to the time of excavation, but are instead taken several years after. To further compound the question, during the initial excavations, many of the paintings in room 16 had been moved to the nearby museum and many of the garden statuettes to storage. As a result, it is difficult today to truly understand, simply by standing in the space, how the garden might have interacted with the wall paintings in the surrounding rooms. The digital illustration thus allowed us to annotate and compile all of this visual evidence into one location and then consider the sculptural arrangement in the garden as well as the surrounding rooms. Once the sculptural program and removed wall paintings were digitally reinserted into the garden, it quickly became clear that one of the primary iconographic themes is Bacchus and his retinue of satyrs, pans, herms, and small animals. In room 16, likewise, we noticed that there were several images of Bacchus, as well as cherubs, libations, and musical performances highlighted in the smaller panels. The central panel on the south wall, for example, depicts a young satyr leading a procession in an ox-drawn cart. Silenus, sitting in the cart, presents the infant Bacchus in his lap in triumph. And to his left, a man plays a set of pipes, and a large container of liquid, likely wine, is lifted onto the wagon. On the north wall, Bacchus is again depicted in triumph over a prisoner seated on a pile of weapons in front of him, while Victory writes a triumphal announcement on his shield. On the east wall, the strength of Bacchus is celebrated again by showing his ability to conquer the mighty but drunken Hercules. To his left, a young woman, likely Omphale, looks on, and around the scene, musicians and cherubim play drums and flutes. Creating a 3D model and digitally reinserting this missing material led us to the conclusion that the primary theme in both of these rooms is Bacchus and his retinue. The central iconographic themes which unite the images and the garden are Bacchus and his respective domains, so theater, wine, and agriculture. It was difficult, however, to visualize exactly how these removed elements might have been orchestrated in the space. The digital illustration allowed us to easily embed the missing paintings and then consider how they interacted as an ensemble. One of the key results of this analysis was the recognition of how the gazes of the painted figures interact inside the room. So while on site, it was clear that the figures in the northern central panel look into the garden, so that's the top left image. And in the 3D model, it was then possible to consider how the removed panels, which are the images on the top right and the lower right, interact. So on the south wall, the wall most clearly visible from the atrium, many figures gaze out towards the central area of the house. So this is the image on your bottom right. So as you entered the room, you would probably see these figures sort of looking at you, and that would draw your eye to them as well. But once you're in the room itself, the image on the top right, and you see the central figure is actually gazing out through the window into the central garden and towards Silenus in particular. And our thought is that this interplay of gazes might have both sort of welcomed the visitor into the space and then directed their gaze outwards towards the garden. So it was easier to visualize this interaction, of course, once all the elements were digitally reinserted into a single space. The garden in the House of Marcus Lucretius thus likely created a Bacchic spectacle that would have been particularly appropriate in proximity to the primary areas of the house devoted to dining and entertainment, such as room 16 and 15, and even, as we'll see in a minute, room 25. To a viewer arriving and staying for dinner, such themes would have been particularly appropriate to welcome guests into an area of convivium, and the overall ensemble would have been an ideal backdrop for an evening's entertainment over a lovely dinner. The digital illustration was also a great tool for experimenting with other view sheds in the house. The conclusions from this analysis were similar to those arrived at on site, that while the views from room 15 and 16 have been emphasized to date, in the last phase of the house, multiple rooms opened onto the central garden. These spaces, such as room 25 that we're looking at now, or the so-called triclinium, likely also visually interacted with the space, at least in the last phase of the house. So while the garden sculpture would certainly have been arranged with the front area of the house in mind, several of the statues might also have been positioned to slightly complement room 25 as well. So these alternative arrangements will be explored in a future reconstruction model. The photogrammetric state model of the House of Marcus Lucretius thus was useful at several stages of the art historical project. First, it made it possible to digitally revisit the space even after the team had left and returned to the States. It was also possible to use the model as a framework to visually recontextualize several paintings within the house that had been removed to the nearby museum. And the 3D model allowed us to digitally notate which paintings were located on which wall and consider how they might have interacted as an ensemble. Finally, the 3D model allowed us to explore different view sheds into the garden, and such advantages were useful when considering such a complex visual program, and in particular, this researcher in conducting visual analysis. The case study in the House of Marcus Lucretius also illustrates how a digital model has the potential to further research aims in perception and viewshed studies. The reinsertion of these removed materials in particular was helpful in considering the gazes of the figures in the large wall paintings in room 16, both as they relate to one another and to the garden itself. Once the material record was reconstructed, it was then possible to consider interactions just because all of the information was visible on a single visual plane. Particularly in the study of an entire archaeological area, visual program, or domestic structure, it's often difficult to mentally hold an image of all of these finds. And so 3D models were a useful way to cognitively offload this information. Once the objects were externalized in the case study, it was then possible to consider these interactions that I've noted between them. Moving forward, we plan to create a reconstruction model on the basis of this state model and then experiment with the positions of the sculpture in the garden. The House of Marcus Lucretius also originally had a second story, so future research will also consider the addition of this architectural feature, and it will likewise be valuable to experiment with how lighting conditions change throughout the day, and finally consider maybe several different phases, so the latest phase, but then also some of the earlier phases in the house and how it was maintained and altered over time. Notwithstanding the benefits of these digital illustrations for research that have been explored, it's an open question how such illustrations can then be rendered into more traditional forms of publication. As in the creation of any illustration, human processes of understanding and interpretation enter in, and it's important to note these. When a 3D model is published, a metadata and paradata report should ideally be included, which lists the sources of information and explain restored elements. An excellent model for cultural heritage data is the Carrara metadata scheme, and the London Charter likewise provides excellent examples of paradata standards. Paradata can just be compared to footnotes in bibliography, so they primarily contain information about how the model is produced and the decisions made throughout that process. Looking to future research, digital illustration is likely to become an even larger part of art historical and archaeological study. As a result, it is crucial that researchers develop rigorous best practices. Scholars have already begun to make strides towards such standards, and I include a brief but by no means comprehensive list here. Nevertheless, one of the potential issues that may arise as the production of 3D data increases is the isolation of projects such as this into project-based silos. Since every site is different, the data sets are often treated as unique entities. One potential solution that we'd like to discuss today would be to create a collaborative database such as the Pompeii in Pictures project or the recently announced Pompeii Artistic Landscape project, where fragments and even entire wall painting panels could be available for viewing and study. Such an open access online platform would undoubtedly benefit scholars worldwide, as well as students of art history and archaeology. What the long-term role of digital illustration will be in art historical and archaeological research is still very much an open question. Throughout this discussion, this presenter has called for an increasing level of critical reflection in the creation of 3D assets. The importance of best practice guidelines, such as those published in the London Charter, have likewise been highlighted. Finally, as 3D models become increasingly used, this seminar has explored the possibility of hosting these models in an online database or an online archive, particularly suited to Roman wall paintings or perhaps even a broader scope. Such an archive would ensure that the results of individual case studies, such as the one I've presented today, would continue to be accessible and useful long after the conclusion of a research project. I'd like to conclude by noting that as sites such as Pompeii continue to face the dangers of degradation, digital illustration may be one of the best options at the moment for scholars to document such sites and consider the impact of these spaces on the ancient viewer. Thank you so much, and I now welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Kelly. I'm sure there will be plenty of questions from the room that I'm gonna show you right now.
Okay. Hello again.
So who wants to start? Okay, I can start if no one knows. I saw Charlotte. Don't hide.
I'm trying to understand, in a way, the product. Can I interrogate your construct? Or is it just supporting an argument that you make?
That's a great question. So I think one of the benefits of publishing the model on Sketchfab is hopefully that other people can view it. I think that's in terms of like what the method for that communication would be is interesting in our, I guess, current era. I guess the best way to do it would be if you wanted to publish a paper commenting on my 3D model. That might, I don't know that we've seen that sort of back and forth interaction yet, but that is something that's hopefully coming, right? If I produce a 3D model, you can then come in with an alternative interpretation and say, actually, what I see here is something much more akin to what's going on in this other house in Pompeii, and I'm going to question your reconstruction by showing that as well. So it's a great, does that?
Could I actually move something? Well, I'm actually thinking about physically interacting.
Oh, okay.
You see, you've constructed it. Now I'm thinking, well, actually, that should be slightly over there, or I don't think that statue was really there.
So I don't think there's a collaborative system like that in existence that I'm aware of yet. I think I can say this. I think we're very interested in that, at least here in our lab, and it is something that we're actively working on, so to speak. But I think I would open that also to Dr. Vitale and Dr. Baudard. I don't think we yet have like a collaborative 3D modeling that's available to everyone online.
Well, some projects might decide to make their reconstructions, their visualizations available, and people can download them and, you know, build on top of them. Mm-hmm. There was a project, quite pioneer project some years ago. I'm not going to name it because now I'm going to say that I couldn't use it because it wasn't documented. So it had a lot of value to me to build on top of someone else's model that was not documented. Mm-hmm. If that model had been, you know, at least, you know, had at least a basic documentation, I might have considered when I built my model of the Temple of Isis, not starting from scratch, but, you know, using a resource that was already available. But because there was absolutely zero documentation, I said, okay, I'll start from scratch and I will document it. But I hope to see more and more 3D models that are, you know, open access so that people can reuse, especially if we finally, also find a good way to attribute authorship, so that people don't freak out about that as well. I don't know if anyone else in the room wants to add something about it.
George should ask on top of that, is there any collaboration with the gaming industry in terms of a platform that would allow you to practice?
I didn't hear.
Simona asked if you are aware of a collaboration, an explicit collaboration between academia and the gaming industry.
Oh, that's an interesting question. I'm sure there are some, but I can't name any off the top of my head. I mean, our project here, so my advisor, Professor Bernie Fisher at the Project Rome Reborn, is available on stores such as Steam, so that you can just download it and access it. But I think it is meant primarily as an educational tool, not as something that is, related to the gaming. I think people have purchased base models from research projects to then use in gaming environments. That is something that I've heard about. But again, I open to the room because, I mean, we're talking to the experts here as well.
Well, there are learning modes in some video games, like, the Assassin's Creed Origins and things like that. But you can only experience them. You cannot interact in any way. I don't know any collaboration that involves a creative venture.
Yeah, when Charlotte asked the question, that was my first thought. Maybe somebody's doing that. Makes sense. Or along the same lines.
Yeah. I'm not aware. That doesn't mean they don't do it, but I don't know about it. Yes, please.
It would be nice because they have great technology for making 3D models. So yeah.
And way more money than.
Yes, and way more funding. Yeah.
King's Visualization Lab tried on several occasions to collaborate with commercial gaming partners, but the objectives are just so different, and the idea of the final product, which is never final, never appeals to any commercial partner. So we collaborated, we tried to benefit from mutual experience, but I'm not aware of any tool which would be made available for scholars to end it. Because the idea, as I understood the original question, the idea was of something like Wikipedia. That one can add, and we have a record of every change made.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I really would love to see as well. So like in producing, I mean, to go back to the original question, in producing the model of the House of Marcus Lucretius, there were already 3D models that had been produced of the site. Excellent work. And I even met with the researchers and chatted with them a little bit about the model. I think the primary difficulty was more of a technological one. So we used different platforms, and even the platform that they had used to create the model not 10 years ago, is sort of out of date at the moment. And so like integrating that data would have been such an enormous task that it just didn't make sense for the project. And they wanted a new version of the reconstruction anyway, which is what we're going to work on next. So I think that's also an interesting question, is when we get a platform like that, how are we going to keep it to the level of like, the latest technology and still use the previous data sets, so that when a new model is created, it can be built on the data, but still be relevant and useful in terms of graphics rendering. So it's, yeah.
Any more questions from the audience? Okay, then I can sneak in.
Okay.
So I thank you very much. I had several actually, but I will start with one that is specific about working on Pompeii.
Okay.
And the fact that so much information about Pompeii is unreliable. And if you think that 3D models, or if you are, thinking of making, use of 3D models to address that as well, that a lot of the images that are familiar to us about Pompeii are actually, fabricated. The statues in the garden, or the statues, in the fountain. They were just staged for, for the old tourist. So if you envision, 3D models also as a way to investigate the provenance of the secondary information, and then address this issue of, let's say, authenticity.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, and that's really something that I try to get at, in the presentation, but it's such kind of a new discussion that I even struggle in how to articulate this. But, I think to use these models as an opportunity to question almost every single thing, that we're looking at, especially when we then go to make the reconstruction. This is something that I'm really excited about, is to say, okay, so here is, the Niccolini and Niccolini image for what this room would have looked like. Well, now we have, in front of us the 3D model of the painting, and let's not just layer immediately their reconstruction, but let's question all of these different panels and to really use it as a research tool. So any element that then goes into the 3D model, there's sort of that layer of interpretation and analysis that's taking place. And then that can just be hopefully embedded, in a comment section. And then if someone else, again, to return to the excellent point raised by one of the questions, if there is a disagreement, I think it would also be a great opportunity for other researchers to come along and say, oh, no, actually, I think it should be presented this way because I found this other documentation, in the archives that shows that, at least at this point in time, this is what this feature looked like on this wall. And so I love the idea that it would be collaborative, and I hope that that is what we see as well. And yeah, I think your point about questioning all the kind of things in Pompeii, that's what I did with the sculpture in the garden. And that's not really the, topic of this talk, so I didn't want to include too much about my MA thesis. But that's actually how I used the model, was in my MA thesis, to kind of think about, is this sculptural arrangement how it appears today? Is that how it was? And anyway, but yeah.
Great, thank you.
Did you have more questions? Or follow-ups on that, I guess. It's sort of weird because I can't see you. Can you switch me back to where I can see you?
Okay. It's okay. I mean, it's better to give, the overview of the public.
Okay.
I have actually a curiosity. How did you pick that house in particular?
Oh, this is a great story. So
It usually is.
Yes. Thank you for asking. You're great at this, the hosting. It's wonderful. So I actually did a paper on all of the resting satyr sculptural series, which is the subject of my paper that you remember I gave last summer, and that we did like an augmented reality thing to think about how the sculpture looks when it's complete versus how it is when it's fragmentary, like the one we have here. So anyway, all that to say, in the course of looking at all of the resting satyrs, this garden was one of the few places where we actually have a record of how a satyr, even though it's not a resting satyr in this case, would have been displayed in a domestic context. So there's also a house in Rome, the Via Cavour, which Elizabeth Bartman has written a wonderful paper on. But this was another one of the, I wanted to really deal with, in context, how were the resting satyrs displayed? So that's how I found this house.
Cool.
Yeah, I like it.
One last question.
Yeah, please. It's always nervous when I don't hear any questions on this end. It's like, oh, what's going on?
I'm just very keen on doubt. and what worries me about all visual representation is spurious certainty. And what can we do to encourage the viewer not to see, just to see what they're seeing, but to question it and to express kind of an image where, well, if we're, according to this document, it would be like this, but actually possibly it was like that. Something which builds into a very early stage in experiencing what you're seeing, a reminder of what the limits are to to the certainties. I mean, some certainties you've got, because you've got images of frescoes which were found in that's fine. That you put them back in place. But there are all going to be all sorts of other uncertainties all over the place. And I just don't know how one builds doubt in and avoids if it's online, it must be true model, which we're fighting against all the time.
It's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think one way that I've seen done really nicely, especially in museum presentations to more general audiences, where especially the risk that you're describing is quite high, because people are interpreting what they see as visual fact, not as something that needs to be questioned and really investigated thoroughly, is to create multiple versions of the reconstruction and show the visitor, different versions, and then maybe a little bit of text explaining, like, in this version, this considers so-and-so's interpretive background, and this is why, this is coming out of this body of literature. That's why we're seeing certain elements displayed in this way, versus another image that shows maybe a different historical, way that it's been interpreted and what that might mean for our understanding of Roman daily life. And I think that would be a really powerful but subtle way to get at your point. Another way could be in the 3D model itself. I really wish that there was a better way to do this. This layering is a very powerful thing. And I know Dr. Vitale has experience with this as well, but like being able to layer different interpretations in Unity, if you're a direct user, could also be another way. So if I'm a researcher looking at one interpretation layered on top of another, layered on top of another, again, I'm immediately getting that kind of subtle, okay, I need to really question which of these is the quote unquote true, visual presentation as it might have been in antiquity.
I think the graphic style might also help. I'm not a big fan of very realistic models because I think they reinforce this perception that they are the only correct one. So I prefer, a more sketchy drawing-like style more than a photorealistic one. But I agree that, showing variants, it's definitely the best way to communicate that this is just an hypothesis. And multiple variants can be equally valid based on the same source information.
Yeah, that's true. Graphic style. It's always the programs. I mean, I feel like especially the 3D data capture is always, aimed at the most photorealistic. So, we want it to look as real as possible. But it would be nice if we could get some techniques built in that are kind of like a little bit dimmer, just sort of a way to say, oh, we're not quite so sure about this part, so let's put this in a little less vibrant way on the screen for the user.
Okay, if we have one more burning question.
Yes, keep them coming.
Not a burning question, just curious about, well, it's a question partly about archiving, because of the huge amount of data that you're producing. You talked about 2,000 photographs for seconds.
Yes.
That will take up a lot of disk space, and then the 3D model will presumably be huge.
Yeah.
So it's partly a question about what are the archive implications of this. Well, what is your strategy for keeping this material safe? Do you preserve all of the photographs as well as the model? And also then, how much of that do you make available to other scholars? Presumably having, a tar file with 2,000 very high resolution photographs plus, a multi-gigabyte 3D model available for download isn't feasible. But what is feasible and what is desirable?
So and I haven't quite figured out if this is a resource accessible to everyone. It's not unclear from the documentation that I read online from our university, but we actually at Indiana University have something called the Scholarly Data Archive. And so this is a massive thing that's both hosted online, and then it's also backed up on 3 physical, in tape recordings in 3 different locations within the state. So the data for this project is backed up there because your concerns are perfectly, you know, especially for really defending this as a method of preserving in the event of something terrible, you know, happening on site. Like, they really do need to have an extremely thorough record. So that's in terms of the photos themselves. Again, the problem with, you know, I upload the 3D model file there as well, but if you don't have the software that I have, or if you've, you know, used something else, I mean, there are much more general ways to extract this data, like OBJ and things like that. But like, if you actually wanted to go in and edit the file or edit the photos, right, you probably have to have the software that I used, or you could redo it, I guess, in your own software. Photoscan or whatever your preferred method is. So that's in terms of the processing file itself. I'm trying to remember the last component of your question, which was an excellent one. Oh, other people accessing the data. So this is something that I think, going back to a previous comment that was made, you know, there's always this concern about authorship, and, you know, if I make all of this data available online, you know, I'll be quite honest, even as a scholar, you know, I don't mind as long as you cite me, you know, and that's great. But I think having a clear system for how exactly to do that would be really helpful. And I know at the conference last year, the Rome Art History Network, we talked a little bit about like what a legal framework for that would look like. Because it would be great, you know, to just share this. And if someone else wanted to come along and do a more thorough reconstruction, a better reconstruction, they want to take more photos. To actually answer your question, I don't know that I feel completely comfortable with the standards as they exist thus far to just make this data freely available. But I hope that within the next couple of years, as more of these systems become available, you know, to just make this available for everyone. And then there's maybe some sort of citation format that I know that anyone that uses it will cite and then use it as they see fit. That's a very honest answer to your question. It's just something, yeah, we're still a little nervous about, I guess.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that we can maybe thank Kelly and stop this official recorded for posterity version of the seminar. And if you like to stick around for a little bit of more informal discussion for a little bit longer, I can just, you know, stop the broadcast, but keep you online.
Give me the really hard questions after we end the video.
Yeah. Thank you. And thank you to everyone that followed the entire seminar series, I'm sure, this year. So see you next year.